Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Host the ultimate backyard barbecue with Whole Foods Market. It's the hot grill summer event through July 16th with sizzling sales on no antibiotics ever boneless beef ribeye steak and beef New York strip steak. Plus, check out sales on sustainable wild-caught Alaska sockeye salmon, organic strawberries, and more. In a hurry? Choose grab-and-go favorites like picnic salads and sushi, plus plenty of cooler-friendly beverages. Make it a hot grill summer at Whole Foods Market.
Hi, I'm Caitlin, a podcast producer here at C-SPAN. This week on C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast, the New York Times' Ernesto Londono looks at the use of psychedelics in mental health treatment and describes his own experience with them. Politico Health Care reporter Erin Shumaker interviews him.
Hi, Ernesto. Thanks for joining me today. I'm so excited to talk with you about your book. I'm a healthcare reporter.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And one of the big picture questions that you grapple with in your book is a theme that's come up often in my reporting over the years. And that's what happens when people with intractable health problems, in this case, depression or PTSD, get left behind by the medical system. In your book, you interview, veterans who have PTSD after serving in Iraq and Afghanistan. They're desperate for some kind of mental health treatment. And they hear about an ayahuasca retreat that will fix their problems, in a week. It seems too good to be true. Is it? Is it too good to be true?
Thanks for having me. I do think some of the ways in which the subject is being promoted and discussed sets people up for unrealistic expectations. There's this thing you hear time and again from people who've been to psychedelic retreats, from people who've tried ayahuasca. Oftentimes you hear them compare it to 10 years of therapy in a couple of nights. And while I think people can come to, pretty interesting insights about their lives, about their distress in the aftermath of these really intense and profound experiences, I think we do a disservice by creating the sense that this is a one and done or that this is a silver bullet. But throughout my reporting and my experience in this field, it is striking that the reason people gravitate toward these settings and toward these retreats is oftentimes because they've tried everything else that the mainstream mental health care system had to offer, and they feel that, those tools didn't work for them.
And that's true of you to a certain extent. Like your personal story, you've wove it throughout this book, and you combine that sort of with this clear-eyed investigation of the risks of psychedelics. And I'm curious if you can talk about that a little bit. What sort of set you up to take this journey, and then on the flip side, what the darker side of that is?
Yeah, so for me, this began initially as a journalistic interest. When I moved to Brazil in the summer of 2017 to start a new job at the New York Times, I had this story idea on my list. And the genesis was a conversation with a psychiatrist at Yale who had mentioned to me at a party that these psychedelic retreats in Latin America were becoming a really interesting field, that there were more and more of them. They had become more sophisticated and expensive, and intriguingly, that they were drawing many veterans with PTSD, with depression, with substance use issues. So I kind of tucked this idea away in the back of my mind as I started this new job. And lo and behold, in Brazil, during my first few months of this new life and this new stage of my career, I became deeply depressed. And what had begun as a journalistic interest soon turned into a personal quest. So sometime toward late 2017, when I was at a low point, one sleepless night, I Googled ayahuasca retreats Brazil, and I stumbled into a website for a center for a center run by an Argentine woman who's a psychotherapist by training, and watched this really intriguing but also kind of loopy video in which she describes what people experience during ayahuasca ceremonies and how it can shift their mood and their outlook on life really profoundly. And I was kind of hooked. There was something very resonant about this video and this woman and her voice. And the following day, I applied for a retreat, knowing little what to expect. And a few weeks later, got off a plane and found my way into her mysterious compound in the jungle.
I was actually really struck by that anecdote in the book, and also the role that social media seemed to play in your personal story. You saw this Instagram ad, I think you said, and I'm sure you did some due diligence to vet these places that didn't make it into the book, but I was so surprised by that. Like, you couldn't be a more skeptical and media savvy person, but you picked this retreat in a way that is, through social media advertising. What does that mean for people who are perhaps less skeptical and less media savvy than you as a New York Times reporter?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think a generous characterization on your part. Because when I look back on that era, that period of my life, I was in a fog of depression. And I think one of the things that happens when you're in this downward spiral is you lose the ability to think clearly and critically about the choices you make. So I think when I look back on my choice to put my trust in this woman who I didn't really know, who didn't really have any clear credentials for this kind of work she was doing, was based more on an intuition. And what I've found, in the years that I've been studying this space and this field, is that very often people put their faith in what sounds good and appealing to them. And I think as the sector has become more competitive, you start seeing more and more bold claims by the people who facilitate these experiences and have commodified these experiences. And I think what that leads us to is kind of an ecosystem now where oftentimes the most vulnerable and desperate people end up putting themselves in the care of the practitioners who have the fewest credentials and sometimes the fewest safeguards. So that, can be a little bit of a recipe for disaster. I think in my particular case, I find that, looking back, I put myself in the care of somebody who I think meant well and had significant experience in this field. Somebody was careful in how she screened applicants for retreats and how she, kept a very close eye on people. One of the things she does is she runs pretty small groups. She usually hosts no more than 15 people at a time. And that gives her the ability to really track carefully how people are feeling and reacting in the aftermath of these experiences. But, it soon became clear to me that that's not the norm in this field, that other people are far more careless.
Yeah, you mentioned the most vulnerable, and I want to quote from the book a little bit here. But in the book, and you're referencing the work of a sort of watchdog professor type here, but you write, that that he's been struck by how gullible even well-educated people become when they're in distress. And I wonder if we can talk about that, like the ethics of rolling out a treatment when it's pretty clear that at least some people will likely use it to exploit others.
Yeah, I think what's happened in the last 5 years is, among serious and rigorous researchers, clinicians, psychiatrists, neurologists, there's sort of a growing consensus that these compounds hold great promise, that they induce changes in brain activity and they induce sort of shifts in mood and outlook that appear to be, remarkably effective, especially compared to some of the conventional tools in the toolbox, things like antidepressants or some of the standard treatments for addiction. So I think there's sort of a growing and coalescing consensus that these tools can be a game changer for both addiction medicine and for psychiatry, But because they remain illegal and Schedule 1 compounds under federal law, very, very few people have been able to access them through sort of the front door, through a clinical trial. So where that's left us is, in the collective imagination and sort of public perception, there's growing interest and appetite in these treatments and these therapies. And I think individuals who are suffering will look at the growing scientific consensus that these can be, very therapeutic tools and say, well, I want in. And then there's very, very few places that kind of offer this in sort of a clinically careful, in a clinically validated or in a very careful clinical setting. So where this leads you is the world of retreats, many of them in South America, which has become a little bit of a laboratory for this field of both mental health, but also mental health with sort of a dash of spirituality. And closer to home, here in the United States, the way in which people typically find access to these experiences and to these therapies is through spiritual settings. Oftentimes, organizations run by therapists who used to work in the underground, but now are operating above board, having organized and formed churches, psychedelic churches, to offer their services.
Yeah, I think that spiritual element is pretty interesting, and it definitely comes up in the book. You mention being someone who was raised Catholic and then stopped, going to the church in part because as a gay man you didn't appreciate the church's view on gay people. And so, but at a certain point in the book, you seem to become both sort of a true believer, and correct me if I'm wrong, in psychedelics as a mode of therapy, and also, somewhat you reach a sort of religious place, like in yourself. And can you talk to me a little bit about that line between being this skeptical New York Times former war correspondent and at the same time having this sort of newfound spiritual element to your life?
Yeah, I think when I first stumbled into this, it'd be fair to say that I was, somewhere on the agnostic or atheist side of the religious scale. And had never really prioritized a spiritual practice or, really found value in sort of pursuing that for my own personal, journey. But I think one of the things I recognized early on is many of the people who start on the path of psychedelic healing or who use psychedelics for introspection, many people stumble into some form of a spiritual practice. One thing I found was many people start meditating, and meditation becomes a pillar for them in terms of how they start making peace with an unruly mind, or just kind of, modulating a little better their nervous system and their thinking brain. But also, I think many people, through the prism of psychedelic experiences, become really intrigued with some big existential questions that historically, I think, we've leaned on organized religion and religious leaders to, wrestle with and think through. What are we doing on this planet? What is the point of existence? What is consciousness? So I do think for many people, psychedelics or mind-altering experiences of these sorts do open a door towards spirituality. And then I think the really intriguing question is whether that so-called spiritual awakening or these, so-called mystical experiences, are they a bug or are they a feature of how these compounds end up being therapeutic for people? I think one of the things I discovered is for people who find sustainable and lasting healing or reprieve from suffering after psychedelics, I find that it typically was not necessarily that the psychedelics kind of unlocked or unclogged something permanently. I think it's more that they kind of point in new directions. And oftentimes, those new directions have some dimension of a spiritual practice.
That's interesting, and definitely something that I've talked and thought about with researchers a bit. I mean, it makes me think of the two pathways that we're sort of seeing for psychedelics in terms of policy in the U.S. right now, and you've got the super medical model, and then sort of the more opening up use for all model is a colloquial way of maybe putting it. Do you have any feelings about that? Like, do you think that do you believe in that super medicalized, go through the FDA model, or do you think that might constrain access in a way that is negative?
I mean, I think we're likely to see kind of an open tent approach for the foreseeable future. I think there's a lot of value in the clinical model, in something with a lot of padding and a lot of safeguards. And I think many people will feel more comfortable doing this with licensed clinicians, doing this in a system and a place that feels, extremely safe. I think if this comes wrapped in sort of a spiritual cloak, that may turn off people who, otherwise might gravitate toward this space. So I do think there's definitely value in doing this and pursuing this and opening kind of the clinical and the FDA validated roads. And I think the earliest taste we're going to get of that is likely to be MDMA therapy for PTSD, which I think is likely to come on board later this year if and when the FDA approves that therapy. But I think early on, the price tag for those therapies and those experiences is going to be extraordinarily high, because the way these protocols were designed in the pursuit of FDA approval makes them very intensive in terms of therapist hours. Right now, the model involves, being in a session with a couple of therapists who spend, several hours with you, and then do usually a few sessions before, a few sessions afterwards. So I think, there's going to be sort of a price point limit to how many people can afford this therapy once it comes online. I think there's an open question as to whether insurance is going to cover some of these early modalities that become clinically available. And I think, in the meantime, we are likely to continue to see this, what I call the Wild West of psychedelic retreats, or, spiritual communities that use psychedelics as sacraments. I think that's going to continue to grow. And I think it would be interesting if there's sort of cross-pollinations between the two. I think from the clinical side, we may learn important lessons about, safety and patient screening and how to handle and report and track adverse outcomes. What can we learn about, what kind of patients don't really find healing with psychedelics and actually may walk away being more destabilized. But on the other hand, I think like the more informal and unstructured setting also has some valuable lessons. One of the things that I found really interesting and special about the retreat setting is that something kind of magical happens when you go into these experiences in small groups and you start seeing and hearing echoes of your own suffering and your own distress in other people's stories. So, the extent to which we can sort of find ways to adopt this communal model of healing and the sort of support group system of healing, particularly when you bring together people with similar life experiences or similar kinds of trauma. A lot of really sort of interesting and rich bonds occur in these settings. And to me, they were sort of, a crucial element of how these experiences ended up being clarifying and healing. And when you think about what mental health care looks like now, kind of in the mainstream system, it can be kind of a solitary and somewhat sort of stoic setting. You go and talk to a therapist. The therapist usually discloses very little about themselves. You don't often kind of get a hug. So, I think there's a lot of really interesting and useful things that are emerging on both sides of the aisle. And in an ideal world, I think we'd be able to sort of pick the best of each and maybe sort of create rules of the road to do away with some of the elements that are problematic in each setting.
Yeah, it does make me curious about how the FDA is going to deal with the therapy piece of that application. That's sort of uncharted territory for them.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Wild West of these retreats, and I do want to talk about the good things about them, but you detail some of the risks at these retreats pretty extensively. Tell me some of them are quite serious. What are some of the risks of unsanctioned treatment in another country?
Host the ultimate backyard barbecue with Whole Foods Market. It's the hot grill summer event through July 16th with sizzling sales on no antibiotics ever boneless beef ribeye steak and beef New York strip steak. Plus, check out sales on sustainable wild-caught Alaska sockeye salmon, organic strawberries, and more. In a hurry? Choose grab-and-go favorites like picnic salads and sushi, plus plenty of cooler-friendly beverages. Make it a hot grill summer at Whole Foods Market.
Sure. I think one big problem in this space has been boundary transgressions, and specifically instances in which facilitators of these experiences end up sexually harassing, or in some cases, even raping people who put themselves in their care. There's a long history of this happening in the Amazon, where, I think some of the earlier iterations of this retreat model took root some years ago. And I think over the years, oftentimes when somebody becomes a victim in these settings, the tendency is to just not speak up. I think there's an element of shame of having sort of put yourself in a really vulnerable situation. I think there's kind of the element of stigma that still surrounds any use of compounds that are sort of construed as drugs. And I think also for people who have found healing in this space, for people who have had good experiences, there's been a reluctance to draw attention to some of the things that are really problematic about the field, and to try to bring down people who have carved out, important roles for themselves. So there's been a little bit of a sort of a collective silence surrounding the scope of sexual abuse. And, I was kind of astonished to see how many people who, have faced for years allegations that they engaged in predatory behavior and oftentimes raped people have managed to kind of like reinvent themselves and rebrand and, kind of start, go quiet for a year in the wake of a scandal, but then resurface under a slightly new name or brand and kind of get a fresh start without really facing significant consequences. The other issue that I think is important and disturbing is how much upselling happens in these settings. If you come in the front door seeking psychedelic treatment, but then some of these retreat centers start selling you on all these other things that they claim could turbocharge your healing. I think some really problematic and abusive things can and are happening. I write about one retreat center in Costa Rica that promotes itself very aggressively. He tells prospective clients that 97% of people who go there walk away having experienced a miracle. And one of the things that happens at this particular center is by day 4, once you've been through this back-to-back marathon of very intense ceremonies with ayahuasca, and you've sort of been kept sleep deprived because there's workshops to go to during the day, then they start selling you on things like stem cell therapy for $17,000. And, much to my astonishment, people who seemed, really smart and critical thinkers, sort of walked in and thought this was a good idea and a worthwhile investment without really asking themselves whether what they were being told and sold was too good to be true.
Yeah, on no sleep, you could sell me just about everything. Like the sleep deprivation aspect was concerning to me too. So I'm curious, like you detailed a lot of these sort of abuses, or at least, instances of exploitation in the book. These are happening in retreats in other countries. There's also been some backlash in the past few months kind of toward MDMA therapy. I'm thinking of the ICER report that was critical of how the clinical trials were conducted. There was a Business Insider investigation into the researchers conducting some of these trials, and then a citizen petition, asking for a public hearing to share their concerns about MDMA assisted therapy. And what do you make of that backlash? Like, is that founded?
I mean, I think there definitely are tough questions to be asked of all stakeholders in this field. And I think when you look at what's happened on the kind of clinical and research side, I think there's a case to be made that many of the people who have been doing this research and many of the people who are funding this research are true believers, are people who have very, very strongly held views that psychedelics, are the answer to many of life's problems. So I do think there's a difficult and valid question to be asked of whether that level of enthusiasm and personal and professional investment in the answer they wanted to find, which was that these are good and reliable tools, has tainted the science and has maybe left us more optimistic than we ought to be. So I think it's healthy for people in this space and in this field to be asking difficult questions. I think the clinical outcomes we've seen in the MAPS trials and in PTSD psychedelic research writ large, I think are very encouraging. It's hard to sit through dozens of interviews with people and to watch, people sort of before and after these experiences and not walk away thinking, yeah, this has enormous potential and that this really kind of shifts the trajectory of a person's outlook and mood in a really fast and reliable way in some instances, in some settings. But the key questions, I think, are, how can you replicate that safely and sustainably? And have we built in enough skepticism and enough safeguards to really give this field more runway? And, I think if and when this comes online in a clinical setting and becomes more accessible, my sense is that we're going to discover that there was a little too much hype about just how effective this form of therapy was going to be for everybody who met the diagnostic criteria. And I think there's going to have to be a little bit of recalibration of expectations. But I think on the other hand, when you look at how many people are suffering and not finding reprieve in anti-anxiety medication, in antidepressants, if you look at how hard it's been to really make a significant dent in the veteran suicide rate, there is no surprise that many, many people, and not the true believers, but I think, people who were a little bit skeptical about the field of psychedelic medicine are warming up and are saying, let's give this a try, let's study it, let's see, what the scope of the benefits are and also what the limitations are. I think at a time when the Department of Veterans Affairs seems really eager to lean into the space and to fund more trials and to make this more accessible to more veterans, I think that is going to give us a really clear sense of how reliably this works, for what kind of people it works, and how it can be incorporated into mainstream medicine beyond the government's healthcare system. But I think the jury is still out, 5 to 10 years from now, as to whether, the kind of upbeat narrative that I think we've seen evolve ever since Michael Pollan's book came out in 2018 is going to feel like we overreached and we went overboard in our collective enthusiasm.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think it's interesting that you mentioned the VA. I was really struck by what the VA Undersecretary of Health said a few weeks back at a psychedelics conference about the VA if MDMA does get FDA approval, wanting to kind of lead the way there on that research. I mean, those seem like two things that you wouldn't expect to go together, the VA and psychedelic research. Like, does that surprise you? Is that a natural pairing?
I mean, I think the VA is very invested in research and development of new therapies. I think especially in the aftermaths of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, there was such an epidemic of PTSD and also traumatic brain injuries that I think there was, a recognition that the tools in hand were failing way too many people. And, a sense that it was worthwhile to think outside the box and to try things that felt a little bit, difficult and uncomfortable. I think what happened at the VA is a really interesting story because the early seeds of this were planted by a handful of clinicians who, weren't necessarily kind of huge names in the field, but were people who had stumbled into psychedelic medicine as a field, outside the scope of their work, saw how many veterans were suffering and weren't finding a reprieve with, the things that they could offer them institutionally, and made a case to sort of overcome the regulatory hurdles required to administer these compounds as medicine within the government, which was a huge amount of bureaucracy. The last chapter of my book takes people behind the scenes on the very, very first MDMA study, which was conducted by a couple of early career clinicians in California. And I think, once a few veterans started getting access to these therapies, word got around and there was just huge enthusiasm in the veteran community for this. I think there's enormous demand. I think the VA recognized that there was enormous demand, and they recognized that the early science is pointing in a really encouraging direction. And I think if there is one place where you can sort of bubble wrap these experiences and, administer these compounds with, a lot of care and a lot of thought, and also very kind of carefully document the patient outcomes, it is in the VA system. Oftentimes somebody will walk away from a retreat in the Amazon and post, an effusive review or a testimonial on social media, and you kind of walk away thinking, this person's life is forever changed and what an extraordinary outcome. But you very seldom hear what happened to the patient 6 months down the line. Was this sustainable? Did it really lead to, a far better and healthier life? And so I think in that sense, the paperwork and the protocols at the VA and their ability to track patient outcomes over a long period of time is going to tell us important things about the efficacy and just how long the effects of some of these interventions last for patients.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a good point. I mean, for you really do detail your experience in the book. It's been a few years. What has that been like for you? Have you seen lasting change?
A happy ending through and through. Yeah. I think I definitely have seen, very profound changes in my life. And I can talk to you about some of the concrete things that happened kind of in the aftermath of these experiences. One of the things that happened in my case, which was somewhat mysterious, but it's actually pretty common, is after my first psychedelic retreat, I never wanted to touch alcohol again. And that was very surprising to me because I used to really enjoy drinking, especially wine and scotch. And the idea that, I would go cold turkey overnight seemed inconceivable. So one thing that happened was, in this altered state of consciousness and in the aftermath of this first retreat, I clearly understood that my relationship with alcohol had been problematic and that alcohol had been detrimental both to my physical and mental health. So I was able to sort of cut alcohol from my life pretty seamlessly in ways that to this day are a little mysterious to me. But I think that was kind of one important way that I turned the corner and pivoted away from something that was harming me. One other important thing that happened was I intuitively, after being somewhat mesmerized by what these altered states reveal about the mind and kind of my own relationship with my thoughts and the way thoughts turn into sort of beliefs and turn into feelings. I became really interested in kind of the idea that you can start reprogramming the mind and sort of deeply rooted patterns of thinking. And I started a meditation practice, and I kind of sensed that that was a more sustainable and a durable way of kind of renegotiating my relationship with my thinking mind and the way my thoughts made me feel. Um, and that's been a really rich investment for me, investment in time and effort. But it's been, I think, a real pillar of, the way I um, manage adversity and kind of the whiplash of life in this day and age. And I think it may sound corny, but early on in my psychedelic experiences, I kind of realized that I had been prioritizing some of the wrong things in life. And that, the one thing I really hadn't gotten right was my approach to romantic relationships and love. And once that became sort of crystal clear, and once I really zoomed into that idea as something that, was a big factor in why I had become depressed and why I had built a life that was pretty lonely, I was able to really kind of start thinking critically and ambitiously about what it would mean to be successful at love and be more open to sort of, having good and healthy relationships. And it took a lot of work. It took a lot of intention setting and risk taking. But that side of my life has been, really rich and, also, contributed to allowing me to navigate periods of depression and slumps in ways that are far less destabilizing than they were in the past. So I think, the short answer is I think psychedelics kind of unlock insights, and it almost like kind of gives you a key to open a door. And once you step inside and take a look at the mess in the room and turn on the lights, then the question is, do I have the wherewithal and the discipline to start straightening out these messes that I now see more clearly? And in my case, I think it's been a work in progress. It's been a lot of time and effort, but I do feel I've made tremendous headway, and I do feel that to a large extent, I was able to do that because these ceremonies and these experiences gave me clarity.
Yeah, no, it sounds like you've done, a lot of extensive long-term work even beyond the retreats themselves. But I am curious, I'm sure people would be interested in what that key looks like. Like, what is an ayahuasca retreat like? What's happening there?
Well, there's a broad spectrum because I've sat in ceremonies with indigenous people who, for whom this looks like kind of a big wild party of singing and dancing collectively all night. I participated in Santo Daime rituals. This is a syncretic church that began in Brazil, and also involves sort of drinking and dancing and singing and a communal ritual. But I think the more standard and sort of accessible version of this is a retreat where you sign up to go and participate in a handful of ceremonies, anywhere between 3 to 8 over the course of, I don't know, a long weekend to a couple of weeks. And typically what happens is on ceremony days, ceremonies typically are held at night. You meet in a room, a ceremony room, oftentimes called the maloca, when it's in the jungle. Each person gets a cot, a pillow, a blanket, and a bucket, because oftentimes people vomit after they drink ayahuasca. And there's either recorded music or there's live music. I participated in ceremonies run by indigenous healers who sing songs called Icaros. And the way they describe these ceremonies and these rituals, they say they channel the spiritual realm, which gives them the ability to sing the right songs to the right person at the right time to sort of unlock something that is stuck within them. What happens, I think, for people in ceremony varies widely. Sometimes you'll have a ceremony where you will feel connected to, I don't know, divine realms, where you feel very, very peaceful and you feel very, very soothed. And it's almost like your thinking mind goes on standby and all you feel is kind of the state of ease. Oftentimes, I experienced far more difficult journeys. Some of the things that happen to people in ceremonies and to me specifically is you feel like you're being drawn to revisit some old and oftentimes very difficult memories. And it's almost like you're kind of being forced to sit with something that is really uncomfortable, can be triggering, and to kind of revisit and relive this scene, oftentimes can be from childhood, in a way that inevitably leaves you with a different perspective about what happened, about how it made you feel, about how other people acted. And I think one of the things that was really useful for me is collectively, having the ability to kind of zoom in on these different versions of my earlier self. And sometimes it was very destabilizing in the short term, and I wanted to do anything to kind of get away from feeling and reliving these moments. But I think inevitably, I walked away feeling deep compassion for the person I was at that time and for the tools I had at my disposal. So it's almost like these memories over time get reframed in your mind, and it's almost like you get to sort of store them in a way that is more neat and a little lighter to carry through life. But I think at the end of the day, why these sessions end up being healing for people remains a little bit of a mystery. And I think there's a lot of interest, especially by neurologists, to document kind of the brain activity and to, get a clear understanding of what happens with brain function to explain why these tools are therapeutic. But there's a side of me that thinks that we'll never really, really know. And I think that may be okay. It might be okay to kind of live with the fact that much of what this entails is mysterious and may never really be put into words.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder, is that okay? Like, will the FDA think that's okay? Will that be okay for Congress? Like, on one hand, I too, like, want to just accept that some of life is about mystery, but yeah, will our government take that viewpoint?
I don't know. I think it's a really difficult question. I think especially kind of like untangling this spiritual component and the mystical component from these experiences, when and if they become clinical tools, is going to be tricky. And it raises all sorts of questions about how do you regulate these experiences? Do you set limits on the credentials of the people who should be facilitating them? Who gets to draw the rules of the road if this is not going to be strictly a clinical thing? So I think we're going to be wrestling with this for a while. And I think there's sort of two sets of laws and standards that will be applicable. One is the way we regulate medicine, which is pretty straightforward. And, there's many kind of, precedents that we can look at to see how different modalities and different treatments got approved and got a scientific consensus. But then there's the whole question of religious freedom laws. And much of this now is growing and sort of booming more on the spiritual lane. It's being done by people who take the view that for millennia, people have used mind-altering substances as sacraments and something that was valuable in rituals and ceremonies. And that in the United States, we have very robust protections for religious freedoms. So I think there's people who take a very kind of expansive and libertarian view of, how permissible the landscape should be. And to me, it's an open question of whether or not that continues to be kind of, there continues to be growing acceptance for that. So far, as these so-called psychedelic churches and spiritual communities grow and become more visible, we've seen very little interest by law enforcement to step in and crack down or take action. I think the reason for that is when they tried this in the past, they tended to lose in court. But I also think if things get out of control on the spiritual side, if you start seeing scandals or communities that start, kind of turning into cults or people getting harmed, then I think we will inevitably start seeing a little bit of a backlash. And I think the big question for me is whether this is a community that will find the wherewithal to self-regulate and to come up with standards and rules of the road that make these experiences safer for people.
Yeah, that is a really good question and a complicated one. I'm not sure I know the answer to it. I'm also thinking of Congress a little bit, and just because I've been covering some of the psychedelics policy stuff, I was talking with a member of Congress this week about this, and what he said sort of makes sense here. And he was pointing out that people are already doing a lot of these different psychedelics. He was like, veterans swear by it. Mental health advocates are saying it works. Housewives are taking it, with or without the research. Like, what are we waiting for? And I'm curious what you think about that point of view, that everyone's already doing it, and so like the FDA should just move ahead.
Yeah, so for better or for worse, in my current role, I can't get too far into editorializing mode.
Yeah, fair.
But on the other hand, as somebody who spent a lot of time thinking about these issues, I'm kind of glad that I'm not in a prescriptive role because the answers are really hard. But I do think the point that people are already doing this, whether it's on their own at home and sort of self-medicating and taking matters into their own hands, or, hiring a sitter off some website or finding somebody on Reddit or, Instagram that becomes kind of their guide. Like, the reality is this is already happening. The reality is we're in an environment where people perceive that the legal risk of acquiring or growing and selling these compounds is relatively low because law enforcement is a lot more concerned with far more addictive and destructive drugs like opioids. I think that is really the world as it exists. People are going on these retreats and these experiences are being commodified in ways that are strikingly open, considering these are still Schedule I drugs. And people are putting their faith in this, in the compounds and in the people facilitating these experiences. But I do think there's room for lawmakers and for policymakers to start grappling with these questions before they have to do so in the context of a crisis or a series of scandals. I think that would not be the ideal setting and environment to have these difficult and nuanced conversations. So I think the earlier people start really kind of grappling with how should this be regulated? And, how much should we fund more research and what kind of research, what are sort of our blind spots in terms of research that should be prioritized? If and when this really becomes more available, how do we with access? How do we ensure that the people who need this the most can afford it and access it in environments that are safer and more controlled? And I think one of the things that makes psychedelics remarkable in the broader conversation about drug policy is, there's tended to be sort of a partisan approach to the war on drugs, where conservatives have tended to be far more strict in their approach in terms of regulating and prohibiting certain drugs, whereas Democrats have obviously been on the forefront of calling for legal cannabis, for instance. On psychedelics particularly, I think there's a really strange bedfellows phenomenon happening. And much of it, I think, is based on the fact that many veterans are gravitating toward these therapies and have become some of the leading advocates for expanding access. So I think that's created an environment from a policy and politics standpoint where people who would otherwise never agree on anything, and certainly, wouldn't agree on drug policy on any other issue, find a way to agree. that there's value here, that, there should be sort of forward-looking policy making in this space. And it may make it, kind of an easier thing to start chipping away at than, something like pot legalization.
Definitely. Yeah, I was going to say it already seems to have moved ahead of the cannabis train, so to speak. I'm curious what you think about, we've got the MDMA assisted therapy application before the FDA because so many veterans have PTSD. It could stand to really help them if it works and goes through. But a lot of veterans that I hear from and that you write about in the book as well are actually going on these retreats and not getting MDMA at all. They're getting ayahuasca or ibogaine or some of these other arguably more intense substances. And so what do you make of that? We've lumped a little bit all these psychedelics together in this conversation, but I'm curious if you can parse that a little bit for us.
Yeah, apologies. Yeah, I think MDMA gives us a model for how to build this in a clinical setting and how to track patient outcome. But for the foreseeable future, it's going to be pretty limited because it's limited to people with a PTSD diagnosis, and there will be a limit in terms of, just price point. So I do think we're going to continue to see people and veterans in particular, get these experiences and these therapies wherever they're accessible. There's this one clinic in Mexico run by a doctor who's been doing this for years that has treated hundreds of special forces veterans. And it kind of became this sort of shadowy world in which friends of friends started hearing about this, and all of a sudden there was a huge waiting list, and you couldn't get people in the door quickly enough. So I think there's a sense that the efficacy of this right now exists in a little bit of an echo chamber of the experiences that people share among peers. But the science is really in its infancy. It's the science, for instance, of ibogaine as a treatment for traumatic brain injury, which many veterans are starting to use and believe very strongly in. The efficacy of a DMT psychedelic derived from the Sonoran desert toad, something called bufo or 5-MeO-DMT, is also, draws a huge number of veterans and also people with PTSD. But the science on this also is very, very thin. How this works and for what kind of people it works is something that we understand very little. So I think if and when we kind of get through the regulatory hurdle of getting MDMA online, I think a lot of the research dollars are going to start trickling to these compounds. Already the NIH is spending a considerable amount of money investigating ibogaine as a therapy for substance use disorder. And, unfortunately, research moves slowly. Researchers have to be very deliberate, and these clinical trials are very complicated to carry out because you really reliably have a placebo effect or comparison. But I do think, if things remain on track in terms of the research, and especially if the federal government continues to prioritize researching psychedelics, both for addiction and for mental health interventions, 5 years from now, we may be in a very, very different place from a regulatory standpoint. And there may be, far more appetite from politicians and policymakers to create more expansive settings for these interventions and these medicines. I think the question is whether things that are now happening in unstructured settings in the Wild West, might that get too wild? And might you start seeing kind of enough scandals and enough cautionary tales to take the wind out of the sails of what's happening in the more formal research and scientific setting?
Mm-hmm. So I hate to answer questions like these, but I do love to ask them. Can you game it out for me? What's the worst case scenario 5 years from now for some of these psychedelic therapies?
I mean, some of the things that could go wrong, I think, is, if some of these communities that are now operating, retreats under the auspices of churches, if some of these communities, become notorious for predatory practices, be it sexually or financially, and those narratives take hold, then, I think people will start being a lot more wary of psychedelics writ large. Um, you know, if we come to see that the periods of sort of disruptive thinking and more malleable thinking don't necessarily lead people to healthier lives, but could, sort of manipulate or shift people into behaviors or thinking that is detrimental to their health and well-being, then, I think that also would pump the brakes a little bit. And, I think what I mean specifically on that is, if in some of these psychedelic communities you start to see growing sort of trend lines toward, anti-vaccine thinking or conspiratorial thinking about politics, and you kind of see people being, sort of reprogrammed or manipulated in directions that don't end up being healthy for themselves or for their communities and for society at large, then I think we'll also start getting, a more sort of, there will inevitably be more skepticism about how we should be thinking about these compounds. I think the mistake some people make is kind of the underlying assumption that psychoactive drugs and psychedelics specifically are inherently benign and healing. And, it's tempting to hold that view, especially if you're somebody who's suffering, if you're really depressed. But I think the key to whether or not this leads to change that is truly therapeutic and truly beneficial depends very heavily on the setting in which you experience this and kind of the support and the guidance you get after the fact. And I think there's really been kind of a failure to start building the kind of day after models that will make it more likely that people will walk away from these experiences feeling a lot better, and that immediate sort of therapeutic effect then becomes sustainable beyond the mental and the physical effects of these drugs.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point you make about the potential for people who are left out of the medical system in some way to sort of adopt fringe views. Like, I hadn't thought of really that parallel between the anti-vaccine cohort and maybe some people who seek, in a worst case scenario, might seek psychedelic treatment outside of the medical system. That's super interesting.
Yeah. I also on this theme, many people understandably come to psychedelics feeling that the mental health care system failed them. But oftentimes I think some of the therapists in this space become so rigid about their views and their guidance on mainstream medicine that it almost pushes people away from seeking help in conventional settings. And I think that too is problematic. Clearly SSRIs don't help everybody, but for many people they're a game changer and they're very effective medicines. So I do worry a little bit about how black and white the conversations oftentimes are in this space about mainstream medicine in ways that I think can lead people astray and can make them unduly skeptical of things like vaccines.
Right. Well, and especially when some of the treatments for these mental health conditions like PTSD are, notoriously not that effective at best.
Absolutely.
So something I do want to ask you is I have to say the book is a bit un-Timesian. You're forthcoming about using psychedelics. You talk about all these retreats that you're going to. What did your editors think of you going on back-to-back psychedelics retreats over the course of a year? I know you're on book leave, but still.
Yeah, this was definitely an unconventional undertaking. And I was, honestly a little bit surprised that I got permission and the runway to pursue this. But I think, when I presented this idea to the editor who at the time was running the New York Times book development office, she saw value in what I wanted to do. She thought that I was somebody who would be careful and responsible in documenting the space. But also, I think we agreed that in order to tell a really powerful story and a credible story, it was important to be transparent about my own skin in the game. So this definitely, I think, required a lot of conversations. It's something that I don't think the New York Times has ever done before. But I was lucky to have, very smart and careful editors who sort of walked me through some of the tricky pieces of this from a reporting and a writing standpoint. And so far, the feedback has been very, very encouraging. I think one of the things I've discovered just in the last week since the book has been out is how many people in my life, colleagues, other journalists, acquaintances, have their own psychedelic experiences, and how many people are in the psychedelics closet. So, I felt that I had an important story to tell. I felt that my background and my language skills allowed me to effectively report on this issue from many angles. But I think, wanted to kind of signal that we would all benefit by being a little more transparent and candid about our own mental health journeys and our own relationship with drug use. So when writing this book, I think I'm kind of inviting people to join me out of the psychedelics closet and to have a more constructive and more honest conversation about something that we've struggled to talk about openly in the past.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, I think a tricky thing that you pull off in the book, in addition to, some of the assets that you brought to that reporting that you mentioned, is being able to toe the line between being a true believer who's still able to ask critical questions. And I am so curious how you do that. If there's anything you can share about how you've managed to hold those two things in your mind at the same time and do so pretty effectively, I'm interested to know.
I mean, I'm a true believer in this, kind of in the fact that these compounds can induce really profound changes in mind and mood. I think that to me is, very clear and self-evident in my experience and what I've watched in others. I'm not a true believer in the idea that these are inherently benign or therapeutic tools. I think it all depends on the context and the guardrails. But I think I approached my work in this space with a lot of curiosity, but also a lot of humility about the things I didn't understand. I was clear that I didn't want to shy away from any inconvenient things I found about the space, and I don't consider myself as sort of a champion or an advocate in the psychedelic space. I think the role I've carved out for myself is as somebody who's an observer, who is knowledgeable, but also brings, I think, a healthy dose of skepticism to everything that's happening.
Well, thank you so much. This is all the time we have. We are wrapping up here. I just want to congratulate you again on the book. It was a pleasure to read and a real pleasure to talk with you today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your really smart questions, and I've enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. If you are interested in podcasts about nonfiction books, listen to C-SPAN's Book Notes Plus podcast for interviews with authors and historians hosted by Brian Lamb.